Good evening, and welcome to the Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the heart of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is March 19th, 2015, and we have a lot of news for you, a lot of speculation, and I think we're all should be concerned about what's going on now, what's going on in the future, and also we need to look at the past. The whole world is going through a transformative period right now, from the world of sovereign countries to a world in which sovereignty will more and more become a thing of the past. And what is sovereignty? Sovereignty, national sovereignty, has to do with having a firewall, borders that are virtually impervious to the depredations by roving populations, people who come and go from the various semi-civilized or countries that really are not operating fully as countries, devastated, destabilized, dehumanized populations by predatory leadership, economic piracy, privation, food shortages, and on and on and on. This is why people try to get out of these countries, and they are looking for a better life. And the idea of sovereignty is that nation states have a right to select those people who will move into that and live in that country. Now the methodology that is used to allow people in has been codified over time, over centuries. You have to apply, and you get a visitor's permit to stay for a period of time, maybe 90 days. And countries have this. I was just reading about Argentina, Buenos Aires, getting in, and you can get in on a tourist visa. And then they're fairly lax about allowing you to stay if you want to become an expat. I was also reading about the difference between an expat and an immigrant. And essentially an expat has money, but an immigrant doesn't. And so, but nevertheless, the idea of sovereignty would be, well, this person has money, or this person has skills that we could use, or this person has the language skills or whatever that is used, and we can use this person. This person will be an asset to our country, and I think we should allow them in. I myself helped a guy from Romania get political asylum in the United States back in the 80s, and the reason why he wanted asylum, he was already living here, but he was getting his PhD in mathematics. So he'd already made a deal with the United States to get in to do his schoolwork, to get his PhD, and he was a really very highly skilled guy, good English, and you could tell he was smart, but he was also very political, and he said that he always spoke his mind, and he believed in democracy, he believed in freedom. And so he wanted to go through the whole process rather than going in here illegally to be allowed to get into the country. And it was quite a long process. In fact, he enlisted my help to get in. Now, he had a whole family, his wife and daughter were still in Romania, and he felt that they needed to get out of the country because he didn't like the way the country was going. This is after the fall of Ceausescu, the brutal dictator in Romania. And of course he was executed, and then a new regime took over, and a lot of Americans assume that after Ceausescu fall, a democratic government was installed. Well, not according to this guy. He was a native of Romania. He said no, it was just one group of thugs being replaced by another group of thugs who are just as oppressive, just as criminal as the previous administration or regime. And so he was worried about his family's safety. He was worried about his own safety if he would go back. And he was applying for political asylum. And so what needed to happen was he needed to write an account that would go into detail and explain why he needed political asylum. And he wanted my help. I had good language skills, good writing skills. He recognized that and asked me if I would help, and I was only too happy to help him and to tell his story. And it turned out to be quite an interesting story. It was fairly long, and so I wrote it up as best I could, and then he submitted it to the U.S. government. And I found out later, he said that he thanked me. He said, yes, it worked. I was accepted as a fugitive, a political refugee, if you would like to call it that, from Romania. And then after a while, he was able to bring in his family from Romania. And I don't know how that all worked out, but I assume it worked out well. He was a competent guy. He was good at math, but he was also good with his hands. He was able to, I saw him do some drywall work, hanging drywall, finishing drywall. He was perfectly fine, did a good job. So he would have been able to get a job, even if he couldn't get a job, let's say teaching math at a university, which I believe he ended up doing. So this is an example of how national sovereignty works. It acts as a firewall, too. I mean, not only do you have a selection about the people that you bring into your country, but you also have the idea of a firewall. The idea of a firewall is that the purpose of a firewall is that it's a barrier in case you have a fire in the other country, that it won't spread to your country. That's what a firewall does. We have a firewall between us and our engine in a car. And ships and airplanes have these firewalls too, that is supposed to contain the fire within the chamber that the fire originated and prevent it from spreading and destroying the whole car or ship or airplane, wherever it might be. And this is a metaphor, a metaphorical sort of, the idea is a metaphor and applying to countries. Now, the future world, the people who would like to see one world would like to get rid of this idea of national sovereignty and the tradition of national sovereignty that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and have a free-flowing world in which anyone can move anywhere, and without borders, a world without borders, one world, and the only difficulty is that your government of your individual country, which would no longer have control of its borders, means that the government would be greatly weakened as to who and how the whole system would work. Who runs the show, really? Over the governments of individual countries, there would have to be an overarching government which really runs the show. Because what if one government said, well, I decided I don't want to participate in this one world. We are really having a lot of problems with these immigrants. They're taking jobs from our native people. They are running rampant. They're taking advantage of our welfare system. They don't understand our culture. They're bringing in a different religion, different manners, different attitudes towards women, for instance, or children, and, which we do not accept. They're not a part of our culture. These immigrants are weakening our culture, our traditions. We're very uncomfortable about this, and we're going to set up strong border checks and only allow those people in that we want to let in. Let's say this would happen in this one world that it's envisioned for the future. And there are many people around the world actively working toward this. Well, what would be the result of that? Would the one world, the people who are in charge of the entire world, because somebody has to be in charge of the entire world to run the entire system. If the local governments, the city governments, the state governments, the national governments do not run the show, somebody has to run the show at the very top, administrate it at the very top. What would happen? Are we talking about the United Nations here? Would the United Nations launch an attack against a country which tried to institute strong national borders and just forcibly remove that government regime change that wanted to enforce strong national borders? Let's say that's one issue. Let's say that a country, rather than wanting to enforce strong national borders, decided that things are really tough in the country, and that the best thing to do would be to break away from the currency system and start up a whole new currency system in this country in which the people in those countries would trade in an entirely new currency. And maybe it would be a greatly devalued currency. You know, they're really having trouble financially, and so they decide that, look, we're just going to go to a new currency. Because you have to understand what currency is, what money is. Money is merely a promise to pay. It's like a promissory note. It's an IOU note, except that it's a promise to pay in hard assets, because there is no intrinsic value in a piece of paper which has some printing on it which says that this coin or this bill has a certain denomination. It's worth 10 pounds or $50 or $10 or $1, whatever. It has no intrinsic value. The dollar bill, the pound note, the franc note, the francs no longer exist, but the euro note and all the other currencies they do not have any intrinsic value. By intrinsic value meanings that you could not just simply decide that dollar or that euro or that Japanese yen or whatever has no value. You could just simply, the government says they're worthless, we're bankrupt, and they're worthless. That could happen with a paper dollar or even a metal coin, because the coins themselves they're very cheaply made. It used to be that coins were made with gold or silver, and the silver content or the gold content, whatever else, or in smaller coins would be copper, these have intrinsic value. They have a usefulness in themselves, which has nothing to do with the actual currency amount which is stamped on them. They actually exist. Even if you melted down a bunch of silver or gold coins into a block, it would still have its value because it's intrinsic. and gold coins, copper, and so on have value. They have value in industry. They have value as objects of art, as being, let's say, molded into or carved into jewelry. They're used in electronics. They conduct electricity. They have properties that gives them intrinsic value. So if a country were to say, we're simply going to go our own way, we're breaking free from this global system, then what would the government do? The government, the global government on top. Well, if history is any indication, then the result, or the actual punishment administered would be harsh and swift. You have a punitive expedition, essentially, which is gathered together and then launched against this country, which decides to go its own way, and it is virtually destroyed. We saw this happen. We've seen this happen several times within our lifetimes, in which states that were players and willing players gradually felt that the deal that they were, the hand that they were being dealt, the deal that they had met was no longer being honored, and that they felt more and more uncomfortable playing with the big boys that they had been playing with, and they decided that they were going to gradually pull away. Now, Omar Gaddafi in Libya actually did that, and so did Saddam Hussein. These are both strong, very, very strong and harsh, brutal dictators, but the only difference between them and many other harsh and brutal dictators is that they were very much so full of themselves that they thought they could get away with pulling away from their status as a vassal, I guess, basically, a willing vassal to the major empire of the West that they had been reluctantly working with for quite a long time. And both dictators had actually done quite a bit for their country. They had raised them from a level of poverty to a pretty good standard of living, almost to the point of achieving a standard of living equivalent to, let's say, a European or a Southern European, Greece or Spain or something like that. And then they got too big for their britches, and then they got harshly destroyed, and regime change was operated upon them, and they were essentially disintegrated. Now, one of the last men standing is Syria, who is yet another dictator who also has, in overall, the people of Syria have done pretty well, even though he's a harsh dictator. And what happens with a dictator is that you can get a lot done if you're a dictator, because anytime somebody gets in your way, you simply imprison them or even execute them. And so the malcontents have to keep their mouth shut, and you just go on your merry way, and you do get a lot of things done. That's one of the reasons why the United States of America exists, because the dictator was, in the form of the king, was the way of the world. That's what it always been in virtually every country since recorded history began, with absolute power, and sometimes even regarded as gods or descended from the gods. And so the experiment of the United States of America was conducted by people, by free-thinking, educated, upper middle class or even slightly aristocratic people themselves who were just tired of it and wanted to bring a more egalitarian view. They had a very sophisticated philosophical foundation for coming up with the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the other founding documents upon which the United States of America began and launched into the future, which we're now seeing basically ripped apart, and those original, very powerful and dangerous tyrannical forces coming back into play, into getting their hands on the reins of power one more time, as it's always happened in the past. And this is, of course, what the Founding Fathers warned the American people about in the beginning. And someone asked Benjamin Franklin when they came out of a meeting, you know, in which the Constitution had been basically, you know, being worked on and was finished. And the woman asked him, "What kind of government do we have?" And he says, "We have a republic as long as you can keep it. So let's see how long you can keep it," or something like that. And he knew, and Thomas Jefferson knew, and many of the other founding fathers knew exactly what the dangers were. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance is another saying, many sayings of Thomas Jefferson. Another one was, you know, there's a biblical phrase about beating your swords into plowshares. Okay, that sounds great. Thomas Jefferson's take on that was, those who beat their swords into plowshares will end up plowing the fields of those who did not beat their swords into plowshares. And so this is something that maybe we should consider as a possible outcome for all these changes that we're seeing. A lot of people know about this and are aware of this, and they're working against it very diligently because even though the utopian vision of one world without borders does sound good on the surface, but there is a dark underside to that. And I'm going to give you an example of the UN. Okay, the UN was founded after World War II, and it was very much like the League of Nations, which came before it. The League of Nations failed. The United Nations was instituted because people really felt that since we had just come through this horrific world war, the Second World War, and they perceived it as being between nations, and they thought, well, it's only logical. If we didn't have any nations, we wouldn't have a world war because nations wouldn't be able to fight with each other because there would be no nations. It would be just one happy world. Well, okay, we could take that. There was a lot of enthusiasm about the United Nations. And they were going to have a peacekeeping force, which was not going to be conducting war itself, but would prevent wars from happening. Well, almost immediately, that's not the way it worked out. The UN got involved right after within 5 years after its formation, in a very, very bloody conflict in Korea, which was called the Korean, when I was young, they used to call it like the Korean police action. They didn't actually call it a war because at that time, they didn't like to use that term war because it was not declared. So it was technically a police action by the UN. And so the UN sort of prevented, I guess, the North from taking over South Korea. And that was what it was all about. And then, because the big fear was the communists. So right away, you see an issue. And then right now what we're seeing, and a lot of people don't seem to know this, at least since the 90s, the UN peacekeepers that are going into a country and attempting to, or supposedly attempting to, or they're keeping the peace, that's what they're called, peacekeepers. They're actually exploiting the people that they're supposed to be protecting. And how are they exploiting them? They're exploiting them by taking advantage of their weakness. And I call it the Sex for Food program. That's not really what it's called. But a lot of these blue helmets, that's what they call them, who are stationed in various places around the world in hot spots like where people are desperate, in Africa and Haiti and various countries, they get these local people and they just say, look, you want food? Then, okay, offer up your daughters to us in exchange. And this, of course, is not the way it's supposed to work at all. And also they've been caught, at least since the 90s, in serious sex trafficking. These are UN employees, military personnel, blue helmets, engaged in international sex trafficking. Why? Because it's lucrative business, more lucrative even than drug dealing, even though they're involved in that too. But it's even better because you could use the product over and over, meaning the human being, and always get paid without having to get new product. You just you use the product over and over. So sex trafficking and other crimes, and this is an incredible embarrassment. And people have to understand that given the nature of human beings, certain human beings, who get in a position of advantage or power or authority over other people, they are going to use that power, that authority, for their own sick benefit, to gain profit from it in whatever way. They have no respect for these local villagers. They have the guns, they have, you know, the tanks, the planes, the uniforms, and so all it becomes is one more group of thugs tyrannically taking advantage of those who are weaker than they are. And this goes back to Thomas Jefferson's rather mild-sounding remark or warning or advice about not turning your swords into plowshares. And so this is the situation that we very often find ourselves in life, where we don't want to have to defend ourselves, but there is no choice. And this is a situation in which, like for instance, Iran, you might say, finds itself in right now. Okay, there's supposed to be a deal, a sort of a secret deal that's going on between the Obama administration and Iran about their nuclear program, which they have always maintained is for peaceful purposes. I personally don't like the idea of nuclear energy being used for peaceful purposes or any purposes, because it's dangerous and you don't know what to do with the spent fuel rods, even in a peaceful program for creating energy, electrical energy. It's pathetic and sad that Iran would be doing this. But if they were actually secretly creating nuclear weapons, in a sense I would not blame them, because any country that beats its swords into plowshares tends to get attacked and destroyed, and regime change is thrown upon them, and they're destabilized and thrown into chaos. They're robbed of their natural resources, their oil and so on. Their people they're occupied by UN. The UN people come in and start exploiting them, murdering them randomly, using them for sex trafficking, drugs, and they go to Hades in a handbasket. And the only reason that North Korea has not been attacked is probably because they have nuclear weapons. And it's a very sad situation that it would be this way, but that appears to be the way it is. Now, the game that's being played, that Obama and his people in the administration are playing, is that it looks to me like a setup. Like they're going to lure the Iranians into a deal in which they will make certain promises, in which they will say, well, we promise we won't do this and we won't do that in exchange for this, and then everything will be fine. And the United States makes a promise that we will lift our sanctions, because Iran is heavily sanctioned. We will lift them and we will have verification and all this stuff. But once they sign on to this deal, then from my understanding is if they renege, if they screw up, if they don't live up to their obligations, then it is incumbent, it is automatic that the U.S. president launch. You launch against the country. Airstrikes, boots on the ground, whatever. Regime change, death, destruction, raining down from the heavens, Armageddon, end of the world for Iran. And so what are the chances that the administration, or maybe the next administration, would not find an excuse in which Iran did not, omitted something, or maybe they did do it, but the allies, the Western allies, just said, well, you didn't do it. And they said, well, we did do it. And then the headline reads, Iran denies accusations that it did not live up to the nuclear reduction agreement. U.S. to launch airstrikes as per agreed upon in writing by Iran, that agreed that they would be you get the picture. So then the Republicans come along, and it's approaching an election, and they want to look good. And maybe some of them are genuinely worried, I don't know, about the future. Or maybe it's their own game that they're playing. So they send a letter to Iran saying, we had no part of this agreement. This agreement is merely between the administration and you. We are not part of it. We don't like it. And as soon as we get our man in the White House, then we're not going to follow by this. We're not going to follow this. We're just going to ignore this. Apparently, this type of thing has happened before, where the president overreaches, and then the Congress just says, "Look, we're not going along with it." So you're getting Iran is getting a mixed message. Now, it could be that certain people in the Democrats and certain people in the Republicans don't want to see the destruction of Iran. But for the neocons and the neoliberals who have a grand geopolitical scheme that will encompass a time period of 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years to the end of the 21st century, they think long term, they think big, they have grand visions of expanding a global empire and just gradually destroying the sovereignty of the various countries, bringing in their own people to run the countries, to destroy the countries, to bring them to their knees, to run them into the ground, to keep them dependent on the multinational corporations for their basic necessities of life, to own the water, to own the food, to own the natural resources, to dole them out when, liberally when the country is good and follows orders and grovels at their feet in an appropriate way, but yet can withhold the food, can withhold the goodies, the electronics, the access to the oil, and all that when it suits them, and then that's how you can control the country. We're already seeing this happening. I mean, Henry Kissinger and others talked about this, how good this would be. Agenda 21, UN Agenda 21. This is how you, if someone doesn't go along with you with your views or your plan, your grand geopolitical scheme, your agenda for the future, which is, they think, they tell us, the best for the human race as a whole. But sacrifices have to be made. You cannot make an omelet without breaking some eggs, and somebody's going to have to pay. Some will win and some will lose. And it's certainly not going to be them. The people on top, they plan to win. So they want to get their utopian dream manifested by their children's time period or their grandchildren's time period or their great-grandchildren's time period, because they're thinking in terms of family. They see themselves as players in a continuum over huge time periods in which they are building a legacy, and then it's passed on to the next generation. Then the next generation passes on their legacy, and they're building, and they have a purpose. This gives them a purpose. This keeps them alive. This keeps, like these dinosaurs, like, these, Rockefeller guys in their 90s, they're still going. It's because they are driven by fire that burns inside of them because of the great dream that they have. And they have the power and the money and the clout, the hundreds of billions, and even perhaps trillions of dollars in hard assets as well as cash. You name it, they've got it. In order to bring this about. And you might say, well, why would they care? Why would they care? They're going to be dead. How much longer does David Rockefeller have to live? He's already in his 90s. Can he? Well, again, they have a legacy. They think in terms of families. The Rockefellers back in the 19th century were thinking of the future. And this is a very tight family trait. For ordinary people, they usually don't think at the most more than 20 years ahead. And they often don't really care about taking care of their kids or their grandkids. In fact, many people think that, well, it's really not even a good idea to just hand your kids all this money, all these assets, because it's going to ruin them, it's going to spoil them. They need to struggle. They need to build their own life. They need to make their own money instead of just inheriting an enormous fortune in which they can just goof off their whole lives. And in a way, I see that. I mean, that could be actually a more healthy way of going than building up this fortune and then passing it on. But that's just not the way they think. These aristocrats, they've always thought in terms of families' bloodlines. They're even concerned about who marries whom. Now, my son should marry your daughter because you're rich too, and if your son and my daughter get together, then we won't be diluting our fortunes. We will be compiling and collecting our fortunes together, and this will double our power, double our influence for the future, and this would be a good match. And I see by your family tree that you have such and such person who is related to us in the past. We're already related. So we should be related again. We should continue on the strong bloodlines. Look at how rich we are. Look how competent we are. Look at how powerful we are. Why is that happening? Is that just happening by chance? No, it's happening because we're special. We have the special genes. We are the peak of evolutionary development, And it's clearly proven by how powerful we are. Now, what the reality is, of course, is that they're all psychopaths, and that the reason they have so much money and the reason they have so much power is because they're ruthless criminals. And they run over anyone who gets in their way, and they have no sense of shame or guilt or conscience, because that's what psychopaths, that's the mark of a psychopath. And so naturally they rise through the ranks, and they gain eventually the level of the peak at the very top of the pyramid. Why? Because they're obsessed with it. They must have power. They cannot, they're essentially rather incompetent. To make it without stepping on other people is impossible for them. They're not competent enough to do that. They are competent enough to kill or destroy in some other manner the competition. And right now we're looking at two aristocratic, tyrannical, psychopathic families possibly running for the presidency of the United States in 2016. And it's an incredibly frightening prospect. This is the Bush family and the Clinton family. Can you imagine those two people running against each other? What are the American people to do? And we know that no third-party candidate has a chance in hell of getting elected. There's no hope for that. Virtually, I mean, I would do it anyway. I would vote for that third party. I will. I will vote for anyone who will keep us out of these wars. I'm against killing people in these adventures for profit. I hate to even call them wars. And I think that people, if you want access to the oil, you should make a deal. You don't invade the country. You don't send in special operations, special forces to destabilize the countryside. This is what's happening in Russia right now. I mean, the West, the United States and other Western countries are training, arming, funding fringe groups around Russia, the edges of Russia, Chechnya and other places, to go in and try to destabilize Russia. And how do you do that? You get people really scared by going in and sabotaging things, blowing up bridges, ambushing, killing people, whatever. And these groups, of course, are fringe groups, and they're oftentimes nationalists who are not happy with the centralized government anyway. And so this just gives them more power, and you're supporting them. And if they ever were to win, if they ever were to participate in overthrowing the central government or cutting off a piece of the country to make their own country, then they would find themselves the targets themselves of the giant empire, because they're just being used. We've seen this happen over and over and over. They're just being used as pawns, as proxies, to do the dirty work, the actual fighting, while the big boys sit back, and then they will reap the profits and they will get rid of you later. But for right now, you are useful, you fringe groups, you splinter groups, you nationalist groups, you religious fringe operations. That's just what's happening with ISIS right now. They're part of the group that is trying to overthrow Assad in Syria, which is part of the plan for the United States and its Western allies to completely take over the Middle East. And some people believe that the West needs to get control of the Middle East because this will weaken Russia. For many people, the big fear is Russia, and we're seeing this manifesting more and more recently in the last few weeks and months. A lot of focus on Russia and the power of Russia, and this conflict coming to a head and being sparked not by Russia, but by the Western powers in Ukraine. The Ukraine, which has been very central to Russian culture for centuries, and then there was a regime sympathetic to Russia, trading with Russia, very close to Russia, in the Ukraine, overthrown by a small group, funded by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. A different regime put in place, more sympathetic to the West, and then this sparks the conflict, the huge civil war between the people who on the west of Ukraine who want to support, who are more European or more Western European, and the people who live in the east of the Ukraine, and I'm simplifying this, who are essentially Russian and identify with Russia and want to be a part of Russia. And so both sides are covertly arming, training the various participants in the Civil War. And this is what often happens in civil wars. But it's a proxy war between the two major powers because they can't openly confront each other because they're fearful of a nuclear exchange. Both sides have highly advanced, sophisticated nuclear weapon arsenals, and they have recently even upgraded them. Now, there was some flurry of excitement a few years ago in America where it appeared that America was reducing its arsenal of nuclear weapons. Well, this was a smokescreen, essentially, for an upgrading. Yes, they did get rid of some of the nuclear weapons, the actual weapons, the warheads, the ICBMs, and all this. But the reason was because they were practically worthless anyway. They may not even have been able to lift off because they had been sitting there for, I don't know, 40 years. And, you know, things start to corrode after a while. You don't know if those electrical wiring is really up to snuff. I mean, they were letting things get sort of rusty and clunky and old-fashioned. And my understanding is that the arsenal is actually run by these giant floppy disks that was something that was used back in the 80s, and they hadn't ever really updated. And that also that the Air Force, the dregs of the Air Force were the guys who worked in the nuclear arsenal arena in those facilities, many of them out west, and in other places, I'm assuming Alaska, different places around the world. And you want a dead-end career, get into that. And so these people were probably bored, they were incompetent, and in fact there was a scandal about that. They got in some trouble. Gambling issues, alcohol, things like this. This is pretty scary because these are the guys who are actually in charge of launching nuclear missiles that could cause the end of human life and as we know it. A nuclear exchange between major countries would be devastating to everyone around the globe, and it would be the end of a lot of vast dreams of the future. Now, some of the crazy aristocrat psychopaths, neocons, and so on, actually think that that would be the way to go. That it might not be so bad. After all, they will be protected, they think, in their vast underground bunkers with their... You talk about preppers. I mean, these are the ultimate preppers. A lot of people are actually wealthy people moving to places like New Zealand because it's in the southern hemisphere. And the southern hemisphere is mostly water. And if there is a nuclear exchange, it would be in the northern hemisphere, almost exclusively. And so most of your radioactivity would be circulating in the northern hemisphere. But I hate to sort of bust your bubble, but if things got really bad, it would be like that movie, and there was also a book called On the Beach. in which people were hiding from a previous nuclear war from the radioactivity in Australia. It's a very effective story because it tells the story of a doomed group of people who are trying to live as they lived before, with all their dreams and little love affairs and all this, but essentially knowing subconsciously, and then gradually as the movie and book develops more and more consciously, that they're all doomed, that nobody is going to make it. Now, whether or not this would actually happen or it's just fiction, it's a scare story, and it's from those early days of the Cold War, the 60s, I believe, or the late 50s, and it's a good story. But it's strange because it shows how history repeats itself. We're almost back in that same kind of situation. And Russia is not even a communist state anymore. It's not even like we're that different from Russia. If anything, the United States is more like a tyrannical fascist or communist state than it was, and then back then, and Russia is more like a wildcat, Wild West capitalist state in which people are running around trying to make as much money as they possibly can, and breaking the laws and and tromping on the rules, running around very greedy, wanting to get rich, which is the antithesis of communism. The idea that everything is shared equally, more or less equally. It never works out that way. It's never equal. I mean, even China, which people forget, is still a communist state. You have a very wealthy elite, and you have the rest of the people so incredibly poor, they're almost living as slaves under horrific circumstances in China. And yet, we're looking at China as possibly gearing up to be the powerhouse state to run the world, more or less, in, 10, 20, 30 years. But they're thinking long-term too. So you have more and more, the conflict is coming to a head between the West and the East. My understanding is that very recently there was a movement to get out of the dollar, and the Chinese are setting up a new bank which will take the place of the World Bank and the IMF, and much of the major players, the countries, the wealthiest people, will be moving their assets to China, and this means possibly the end of the United States dollar as the reserve currency of the world, which would be perhaps good for the United States. I think, would it be good? Would it be bad? We wouldn't have the clout in the world if this were the case. Apparently, the pound used to be the world's reserve currency for quite a long time. That's when England and the United Kingdom was riding high in the world. They had the empire upon which the sun never set. You could say that about the West, the Anglo-American empire now. And maybe that's all set to change. I don't want to think of what could happen if a communist and very oppressive government, like the Chinese government, actually got control of the world's financial system, and they were the go-to country for loans to finance the world. That is a very disturbing prospect. I don't like the World Bank and the IMF, but I'm wondering, that's what we're going to be replaced with someone who's even maybe worse? So that's not pleasant thought to have. Well, we'll all see how it plays out, I guess. Not all of us will, but this is just the way the world, I guess, has always been. What do? We just try to stay informed, be educated as much as possible, keep our eyes open, keep our ears open, keep our minds open, because there's all kinds of things that happen. There are all kinds of games that are being run. There are all kind of shenanigans being pulled on people, and we've got to be careful not to fall into that, not to fall into the trap that's being laid for us. There's some very clever people out there in America and other places around the world, many people, that would love to get whatever we have for themselves by hook or by crook through fair means or foul, and they're relying on our ignorance and our laziness in order for them to move forward with their plans, to grab our stuff, if we even have any stuff. Most people, our stuff has already been grabbed. But maybe you have plans to get some stuff and build your own little legacy for your family, let's say, or live comfortably. And so we just have to, because it doesn't take much to fall into that trap. And they, for instance, the housing market, the housing bubble, that really led a lot of people down the garden path during the 90s into the early 2000s. And then finally they pricked that bubble in about 2007, 2008, 2009, right at that time. And many people were over-leveraged. They were too enthusiastic. They believed the hype that the home value that they were buying was actually worth that. And they signed on the dotted line. And then they suddenly were standing there with a title to a home, and that they owed all this money on it, and the house is not worth the money that they paid for it. And it's called having an underwater mortgage. An incredible number of people in the United States now are living in homes that they're basically stuck with. They can't sell them because they're not worth the amount of money that they still owe on the homes. And how did that happen? They believed the hype. So we have to be careful about believing the hype and try to always search for the truth of what's really going on. There are forecasters, there are people out there who will tell you the truth, and they're not often on the mainstream media, they're on the alternative media. So that's all there is for today. Have a great weekend and sleep well.